Alright, hello, and this is week 2 in Psychology 1, and now we're going to look in chapter 1, we're going to look at the theorists, people who have influenced the direction of psychology as a science. We're going to start back in history a little bit and move our way into more modern day and more modern versions of how psychology is being explored today. So I hope that what you do is go through this, remember, use your textbook, use it as a guide, pause the video from time to time. And I hope you get something out of this that's very important or valuable to you, and maybe get some confirmation about things you kind of thought or maybe you've heard before.
Okay, let's look at the historical perspective of the current views of psychology. We're going to start with William Wundt. We'll do a little on Edward Titchener and then go on to functionalism. That's Charles Darwin and Francis Galton, and then over to Gestalt, and then into behavioral with John Watson and B.F. Skinner, and then into psychoanalysis with Freud, humanistic with Abraham Maslow, and then touch on evolutionary and sociocultural, and then touching a beast on neuroscience. Now we'll also do a little cognitive as well. So when we look at these, let's begin at the very beginning. And when we touch base with the father of psychology, we're looking at William Wundt. In 1879, he's a German philosopher and a physician, and he performed an experiment to measure a lag between the instant a person heard a sound and the instant they pushed the button indicating that they heard it. Now, his experiment was so significant because it was about the workings of the brain. Reaction time, essentially. It was the first attempt to study mental processes in a quantitative, number-based. Remember, quantitative research is numbers, data. You can count it. So by virtue of when he touched the button to respond to the buzzer was a number that you could see and then count. And so it was the beginning of quantitative research. Now, we move into E.B. Titchener, and he started what was called structuralism. Now he was a student of Wundt's, and he wanted to search for the basic elements or the structure of mental thought. This approach to explain thoughts through looking at structures became known as structuralism. Now he described feelings as one of three dimensions. This is on like a continuum: pleasure, displeasure, tension, relaxation, excitement, depression. And the most common way of studying these structures was through a process known as introspection. Now, introspection is where the subject was asked to report about their thoughts and their feelings about what was going on around them. For example, would ask them what they were thinking when they heard a repetitive, sharp clicking sound. And so this, again, started to explore the mental process in a bit more of a scientific way. And it was important to the early foundations of psychology. Now, the next two people took a slight different movement away from structuralism and moved into what they called functionalism. Charles Darwin and Charles Galton. Rather than focusing on the structures of the mind, functionalists focused on the way the mind and behavior adapts to change in the environment. This was heavily influenced initially by Darwin's book on the origins of species by means of natural selection. Now, Francis, he initiated the study of individual differences and what the role of genetics or inheritance is on mental abilities. And so looking at function, how do we evolve over time to adjust to the environmental issues that stand out there? Okay, now more modern day sort of ventures, and I say modern day, we're probably talking the last 40 or 50 years, Max Wertheimer looked at what we call Gestalt Psychology. And this was in the early 1900s, so 70, 80 years ago, 100 years ago even. Wertheimer criticized structuralism and introspection approach as being relatively unscientific. How can you measure what you can't see? Gestalt psychology argues that our brain takes stimuli, arranges them into meaningful wholes, not wholes in H-O-L-E-S, but wholes as in completes, or gestalts as he would say, which are greater than the sum of their parts. Now, the example that you see there in front of you, if you look at the images, you might see more than one image. And that's what he means by the gestalts which are greater than the sum of their parts. They're open to interpretation. There's more than one way to see it. You might see the young woman. You might see the old woman. You might see the vase. You might see the faces. You might see the duck. You might see the rabbit. And so Gestalt psychology could be demonstrated in some really neat and sort of unusual ways. Now this next slide, it'll be interesting for you. I'd like you to read it.
So take time to read this paragraph. Pause the video, allow yourself a chance to read it. Alright, you may have had some chance to read it, and maybe you paused it, maybe you didn't pause it. My guess is that most of you were able to read that pretty easily. And this is part of what Gestalt is about. Along with the previous slide where you saw these sort of figure and ground dual imaged images, this is another example of Gestalt therapy where they suggest, and the research that has happened since really does confirm, that our mind is programmed not necessarily to see the world exactly as it is, but to see the world that's useful for us to understand it. Now that's an important variable, that each of us could stand outside and look at what's outside, write down what we see, and would we all have written exactly the same thing? Gestalt psychology would say no, we probably didn't. We wrote down based on what's important to us, our background and what we've lived through would help us understand what's important to pay attention to outside, and so I'd write down those things that my experience has suggested to me are important for me to be aware of. The person next to me on either side would have wrote down what was important to them based on their past experience. And so we wouldn't exactly see the same thing, and yet only one thing happened. So Gestalt therapy, or Gestalt psychology really is about, we only see the world essentially by what helps us understand what's important for us to understand. And so it does explain, why, for example, we might have two, eyewitnesses not see the same thing. Why it is in courts that eyewitness accounts aren't the most reliable.
Now we move into behavioralism and psychoanalysis. Let's put the behavioralism up there. John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner were very profound in the area of behavioralism. They view observable, measurable behavior as an appropriate subject matter. It's countable. You can see it. It's not open to interpretation. Emphasizes the environment as having a key role as a determinant of behavior, and in the environment that would include other people. And so both Watson and Skinner would would say, give me a child and I'll shape them into anything. What they meant by that is that the role of a caregiver and how they reinforce behavior can have a big influence on who that person becomes and how they're reinforced. And that was behavioralism. And a great deal of our education is based on this. A great deal of what we do as parents is based on behavioralism. Now, psychoanalysis, a term Freud used for his personality theory and treatments of disorders, the main focus of what he introduced here was that the unconscious was a primary focus and of primary importance. That a lot of what influences our personality and influences disorders is that which we're not conscious of, things that we have beneath the surface. And so his research was somewhat compromised by virtue that he didn't keep good record, but he had a profound impact of introducing something that we see today and we count today as being this collective or this unconscious. Now, humanistic psychology and Abraham Maslow introduced the focus on uniqueness of human beings, that as much as we're alike, we're also very different, and our capacity for making individual choice, for our capacity for growth and psychological health. He emphasized positive view of human nature rather than looking at what made people do bad things or what made when people are doing bad things, how come they do that. He looked at human nature in a positive way, that people were innately good and have free will. He used or modeled a lot of his theory on the hierarchy of needs, and you're seeing that in the pyramid. And the most normally, there's two additional levels here, but essentially that people's communications, people's motivation were based on whether or not they've got their bottom rung of physiological needs met. That if you had those completely met and achieved, you were able to start to communicate and be motivated by needs and motivation of safety. And if those were met, then belonging and loved. And if those were met, self-esteem needs, and so on and so on. That this was a growth and development of positive and growth of human nature in a positive way. Now we can move into what we call the cognitive psychology, and this is rather an interesting one, and we'll spend some time in a later chapter on this. And this is where these psychologists view humans as active participants on their environment. Unlike in some cases behaviourism, where the environment acts upon you to create circumstances, this, on the other hand, work towards viewing that you would be actively engaged on the environment. So one of the prominent theories of psychology is cognitive psychology. Now what's important here when you think about cognitive psychology is that cognition, or being cognitive, is equivalent to thinking. So it's the process of thinking. Memory, problem solving, decision making, perception, language, and many other forms of cognition are all a part of this study of cognitive psychology. What you're seeing on the bottom slide is a PET scan, and you're seeing the active difference between brain activity of that of a normal person on the left, someone with mild cognitive impairment, and someone with Alzheimer's, and that they can actually see physical differences in the way the brain is actively working. And I think that's you'll see some of the research that's been done in this area is quite profound in terms of understanding how the brain works and how we work. Now, in more current days, you see these different perspectives of sociocultural approach and evolutionary. Sociocultural approach views that social and cultural factors may be just as powerful as evolutionary and physiological factors in affecting behavior and mental processes. Meaning, where you live culturally can have a big impact on how you process information, how you problem solve, how you use memory. So that's another study in psychology that's more current. Evolutionary is to say that studies how humans have adapted the behavior required for survival in the face of environmental pressures. And that's an important variable in terms of, one of the things I hear a lot from students is they have an ability to multitask, and yet evolutionary-wise, our brains don't change that rapidly over time. Evolutionary-wise, if you think that 50,000 years ago, human beings then have the same brain as we have now. So if we haven't changed that much in 50,000 years, I wouldn't expect we're going to change that much in 10 years. It's not to say that we can't practice skills and become good at certain skill sets, but as far as an evolutionary change, not as likely that quickly. And lastly, but not leastly, we look at biological psychology, biological or physiological psychology, which looks at these links between specific behaviors and specific biological processes, like the PET scan. that Alzheimer's patients with Alzheimer's experience the world the way they do, in part because their brain's function has altered, and it's through PET scans and biology that we can see that. Whereas neuroscience combines the work of these psychologists, biologists, biochemists, medical researchers, and others to look for these structures and functions of the nervous system. Now that link at the bottom there, it's to a video that I'll post in week 2 as well, called The Map of the Brain. And I'll post that in week 2. And it's a TED Talk video that looks at some of the current work that's being done at looking at the brain. All right, I hope this has been helpful. Enjoy. And again, make sure you're taking notes. And we look forward to posting some videos for you in week 3 and 4 shortly. All right, everybody, good luck and enjoy. Bye now.